I want to go through chapter 12 and give a little bit of an overview as you go through the chapter and the different parts to give you a bit of background, in particular on the places that you want to pay most attention to and how the chapter is framed. As you can see in the learning objectives, and it's a new part to the book, I was talking about macroeconomic policy, not just about the economic models, although how we relate that to economic policy is going to come into play here. And in particular, we're going to talk about something called the Phillips curve. You'll see that in the learning objectives for the chapter. And that really does form the foundation for all of the information in the chapter. We'll talk about inflation and unemployment generally, as well as the challenges about reducing inflation and the role that inflationary expectations play, and that is particularly relevant for the period here in the current year, 2022, in the beginning of that year. So there's an introduction at the beginning of this chapter, provides some background. It really talks about, we want to take a look at macroeconomic policy and how that relates to business cycle theories, policy debates, unemployment and inflation in particular. So we're going to start here and go to the first section. The first section is really raising this question. This is the one where you really need, the section you really need to lean into. This is the one where you'll see a separate video about the information and topics that are covered in this section. In particular, this thing called the Phillips curve. We'll get to that in just a moment. But it's a relationship between unemployment and inflation based on data in the economy, and what that tells us, or what it tells policymakers about their ability to trade off inflation versus unemployment through macroeconomic policy. So at the beginning of this, we see something called the Phillips curve. It originally came from data in Great Britain or in England over 90 years or so, looking at wage inflation and unemployment. Other people later on started to look at general overall inflation and the relationship between that and the unemployment rate. So in the 1960s in particular, you'll see this is data from the 1960s, 60 through 69. And what you see here is this nice relationship. So we've got unemployment rate on the horizontal axis, we've got the inflation rate on the vertical axis. And so what it says is it's an inverse relationship according to this data. This is actual data from the economy. In this case, the U.S. economy, right? And it says, okay, if the unemployment rate is high, typically inflation is low, and if you move the unemployment rate lower, then the trade-off is that you've got to deal with higher inflation. So there was a lot of following this 1960s. This was in the early 1970s. A lot of discussion in economics about this, and it suggested that policymakers could just decide to pick what point they wanted to have the unemployment inflation rate at. Notice that I was going to point out right now the 2% inflation rate that we oftentimes talk about as a target for the Federal Reserve and come across here. That's about a 4.5% unemployment rate. That would be about what full employment is, perhaps. We might think about it that way, although that can change, as we'll talk about in just a moment. But you can see that 2% inflation rate is about consistent with the full employment unemployment rate, at least based on this data in the 1960s. And we're going to talk more about that in just a moment, about the fact that this is not necessarily a stable relationship, although policymakers at the time thought perhaps that it was. All right. So 1970s, we move ahead to the 1970s, and we find out that, whoa, there doesn't seem to be this nice relationship between unemployment and inflation. Kind of seems to be kind of all over the place. There's no particular pattern that one can see in this data from 1970 to 2017. So over 47, almost 50 years. Kind kind of looks like you could put a straight line through it, maybe, if we were doing a regression analysis. But it's clear that it looks very different from this Phillips curve, this relationship between unemployment and inflation that seemed to be in the data in the 1960s in the US, and for earlier periods in terms of wage data when Phillips was looking at this data at the time. So that brings up this big question, like, what happened? Was that original Phillips curve relationship? Why was that there? And why did that relationship that seemed to exist prior to 1970 seem to blow up in the period and not have any relationship between the two in the period since then? And then, so does it really help policymakers thinking about macroeconomic policy and what they're trying to fight, whether it's inflation or whether it's unemployment in the economy? So there was some additional work then done about this, and said, well, we really need to take into account really unanticipated inflation. And once we do that, perhaps the relationship would be different. What was on this graph, right, is just the inflation rate. And the argument was by Milton Friedman and others was that, well, if you expected inflation, then you might adjust wages, etc., accordingly, and there might not be a big relationship between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. Different unemployment rates could have similar inflation rates, or the same unemployment rate could have different inflation rates associated with it. But if the inflation was unanticipated, perhaps that could mean that something's happening in the economy that could move the economy toward lower unemployment while having higher unanticipated inflation. That suggests that policymakers, if they could kind of fool people, if it was unanticipated, then that might allow them to influence the real economy, employment in particular, and real GDP. So in the short run anyway, but in the long run, presumably people's inflationary expectations would catch up, and it would no longer have that kind of long-run impact on the economy. So let's take a look at that for just a moment. If we look at the aggregate supply or demand curve, this looks a little bit different than what we saw previously, at least in Chapter 9, where the short-run aggregate supply curve was horizontal. Here, we're assuming the short-run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, so that higher price levels indeed can bring about higher levels of GDP, or the two are associated. What's also here is the idea of inflationary expectations. So in this part of the chapter, they're talking about if there are if some increase in aggregate demand, in this case an increase in money supply, is expected, then you would expect the price level to increase, and you would increase your expectations accordingly, and that would shift the short-run aggregate supply curve up and to the left, and you'd go from E to F. Right? So no impact on full employment output, or the unemployment rate. Then, for that matter, you used to stay at full employment, even though aggregate demand was being pushed out through, in this case, monetary policy. But one could perhaps say the same thing for fiscal policy. In other words, changes in aggregate demand really didn't have a big impact on the economy in that case. But what we see is that if you are expecting a certain level of aggregate demand, right, this dotted line, and you adjusted your price level expectations, wages, etc., accordingly, then the short-run aggregate supply curve would shift up in line with that. Right? This was like the aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply curve that we saw above, right, just before. It's this aggregate demand 2 and short-run aggregate supply 2, right, which would be F. But instead, aggregate demand shifts out further than what people thought. Maybe because the money supply increased, the Federal Reserve increased the money supply more than what people were expecting. Or there was some other kind of positive shock. But to aggregate demand, more than what people were expecting. Okay? Well, in that case, people would have adjusted their expectations, right? And the new aggregate demand, which is now out here with the old expectations, so this was kind of a surprise, in other words, the intersection of those two is now at a higher price level, and real GDP is actually increased. Right? So the idea is that if aggregate demand gets pushed out further than what people expect, then it can actually be used to increase output, at least in the short run. Now, people would be, the price level will actually be higher than what people thought. Inflation was 15% rather than 10%. They would adjust their price expectations or inflation expectations more, and this short-hair supply curve would then shift back to the left some more until we're back at full employment. In other words, the thing that's adjusting here is not just prices, but inflation expectations. But in the short run, you might be able to fool people into producing more, into more output being produced in the economy. All right. So there's a video here in the chapter that it would be useful to look at. It's a short video, only a couple of minutes, but it goes through essentially the kind of thing that I was just saying. Ultimately, what that leads to is an important equation that represents the Phillips curve. It says, well, if inflation is different from the expected inflation, right? Kind of in the example we had above, if it's higher than the expected inflation rate, right, then the unemployment rate is going to be lower than the full employment unemployment rate. H is just a number, right? It's the slope between the Phillips curve, essentially, right? It's the relationship between unanticipated inflation, this left side, and cyclical unemployment, which is the difference between the actual unemployment rate and the full employment unemployment rate, right? The natural rate of unemployment, right? Which is made up of frictional plus structural unemployment. You can go back to chapter 3 to learn more about that if necessary, right? And so that what's called expectations augmented Phillips curve, this equation 12.1 turns out to be really, really important. Right? It says inflation rate is related to the unemployment rate for a given level of inflation expectations and a given level of the natural rate of unemployment. Right? So if those are fixed, if those aren't changing, then we have the old Phillips curve relationship between inflation and unemployment with a negative sign, so that's a negative slope, right? Net Phillips curve that we just saw. But if inflation expectations are changing or the natural rate of unemployment is changing, then that's going to change things. In particular, if inflation expectations change, it's going to, this is a shift curve, right? This is a shifter, right? This is the intercept term in that relationship. And so it's going to shift, the intercept shift the curve, the Phillips curve, right or left. So this 12.1, right, that turns out to be a really important important equation for us in this chapter. Right? Everything else comes from this. So it's important to really understand this first section. Okay, and so the next section, the next subsection of the first section is really talking about what happens if there's a change in expected inflation. All right, it's going to shift the Phillips curve, right? This is kind of like that 1960s Phillips curve. All right, here's the full employment unemployment rate, the natural rate of unemployment. And so if inflation expectations go up, the rate of actual inflation that we see in the economy is going to be higher for the same level of the full employment unemployment rate, right, than would have been the case before. Right? Similarly, changes in the natural rate of unemployment, right, the U bar here, right, and so if that changes, it's also going to shift the curve. If it rises, it's going to be a higher level of the natural rate of unemployment for a given inflation rate in that case, right, so it shifts right or shifts left, right. So it's important, again, to lean in. There's another video about that. Again, it's only a couple of minutes long. And then it talks about what happens when you have supply shocks, what happens to the actual Phillips curve data, right, at different points in time, and how can that help explain things. And so here we have now the unanticipated inflation, right? Right? And so there's more of this Phillips curve kind of relationship, negative slope here, right, between unexpected inflation and cyclical unemployment, the kind that with the business cycle, that's related to the business cycle. And so with that, with those two things in mind, right, the moving it to think about cyclical unemployment and unanticipated inflation rather than actual inflation, we get back somewhat this kind of negative relationship between unanticipated inflation and cyclical unemployment. Right? Again, this is all in the first section of that of the chapter, and so that one's the one that's really, really important to get a good understanding about, because everything else in the chapter really follows from that. There's no new information in the rest of the chapter. It's really discussing the implications of that. So section 2 talks about macroeconomic policy. Can policymakers make use of this idea about unanticipated inflation and the trade-off between that and unemployment? And then ultimately, as we were pointing out at the beginning of this video, right, at the beginning of the chapter, right, in the end, your expectations will adjust. Inflation expectations will adjust and bring us back to full employment. So in the long run, there really is no relationship between unemployment rate. There's no trade-off between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate, even though in the short run, there might be. So then the question is, should you try and exploit that short-run trade-off if you're a policymaker to try and affect the economy overall through macroeconomic policy? Right? So that's really what that section is about. When we get to section 3, we're talking about, well, why do we care about unemployment in the first place? Like, why should we even care about that? Right? Well, because there are some costs of unemployment, and when the economy moves away from full employment, the natural rate of unemployment, then people lose their jobs, and there may be, so there's lost output. Right? You can go back to this thing called Okun's Law back in chapter 3. So, higher unemployment means less output. We're not at potential GDP. We're producing less than the economy could. So that's output that could be used for consumption and for good purposes, but it's not available to people. Right? So that's lost output. Another one is that people are unemployed. They may lose skills that they had gained, and it might be hard for them to get jobs back. And it's a bump. Is it a temporary bump or is it a long-term bump? That's the real question. Does it have negative impact on people's psyche? We know that during periods of high unemployment, suicide rates go up, mental health issues go up, etc. So there's a personal cost as well, especially if a recession that increases unemployment rates tends to be long. Right? So sometimes there are some positive benefits. There's a discussion about that at the end. Maybe sometimes people get laid off and turns out they go and start a new business, for example, that really takes off, and they end up doing something different that tends to be really beneficial for them. It's something they like doing, and it pans out and it works out. So that can happen as well. All right. So they're not completely negative, but we tend to think about the negative impacts of unemployment, which is why we want to keep unemployment low toward the natural rate. The next section talks about, or the subsection, I should say, talks about does the natural rate actually change? And perhaps, and it looks, and generally that's probably the case. That is partly because of changes in the labor force, who's in the labor force or who's out of the labor force, and the demographics around that. And you can see what at least people have estimated to be happening to the natural rate. Generally been going down over the last 45 years or so. It used to be, we used to think about the natural rate of unemployment, in other words, full employment being around 6%. Now we tend to think about it, maybe being 5%, may actually be less than that as well. Why does that matter? Because when we're looking at the natural rate, and we're trying to figure out okay, is the unemployment rate high or is it low? We look to some notion of what full employment or the natural rate means. And so having some good understanding of how do we measure it and what is the actual level of the natural rate is important for policymakers. The problem is that that is really difficult to determine. So if the unemployment rate is actually, 5%, is that at full employment or is that higher than full employment? Right? The full employment rate of unemployment is 4% and the actual rate of unemployment in the economy in any given month is 5%. Well, that suggests that maybe we try to give the economy a boost. Maybe monetary policy, maybe they lower interest rates to try and spur spending to get more people employed and reduce the unemployment rate. But if the unemployment rate, natural rate of unemployment is really 5%, not 4%, then then we're good. We're at full employment. We're at potential GDP, and no further policy might be necessary to move the economy. So having a good understanding of what the natural rate of unemployment is critical for our policymakers. But that's a challenge. We don't really know what that natural rate is. It's the rate of unemployment that typically that we think of that doesn't lead to higher inflation or lower inflation. But that's a conceptual idea largely, and there's debate about what that number actually is. So section 4, the second to last section of the chapter, talks about inflation, similarly as it does for unemployment. The costs of inflation are a little bit, you have to think a little bit more about that. You have to distinguish between inflation that's anticipated and unanticipated. It's really the unanticipated inflation that is the most impactful. Right? When people didn't expect it, because people may be making fixed payments. If you're a borrower, that's a good thing because the money that you're paying back essentially is not worth as much to the lender. But lenders are worse off. But overall, it's a trade-off. It's not a total loss. One person's gain is another person's benefit. So that's not for society overall. It's not necessarily a cost, but for the individuals involved, it can be and would be. All right. So and there are ways to reduce the impacts of unanticipated inflation through things like indexed contracts, right? That say, the interest rate that you're paying on your mortgage loan, it's going to change if inflation changes. And similarly for wage contracts, if there's a contract that says there's a cost of living adjustment, then when the inflation rate changes, then that your wages would adjust for that. And so your real wage would keep up with that. So there are ways to deal with inflation that reduce the costs of inflation. We don't think about those costs quite as being quite as significant as for unemployment. Although for some individuals involved, if you're on a fixed income and all of a sudden prices of goods and services and gasoline are going up, you're going to find yourself worse off, right? So people on fixed incomes, fixed wages that aren't adjusting with the inflation, they are going to be worse off. So hyperinflation, the idea that it's 1,000% or 100% a month, that's a whole different ballgame. We don't see that in the United States, but we do see it in different places around the world, even today, and that is a severe problem because people stop using money. They go to barter because the money drops in value just in hours. So hyperinflation certainly is a problem. So is inflation that's too low, in particular because if inflation is too low, what can happen is that the Federal Reserve, in our case, in the United States, but the federal bank in a country, the central bank in a country, might not be able to do a lot in terms of monetary policy if that is the case. So typically the target, and that's what this section is about, talking about disinflation, not deflation, but disinflation. Um, certainly deflation is an issue, but so is disinflation. Right, bringing that's really the next section, how to bring inflation down. But deflation, where prices are actually going down, inflation is negative. That is a problem for policymakers because they can only bring the nominal interest rate down to zero. So even then, the real interest rate is positive, right? And oftentimes that can lead to a situation of recession, and so they have no ability to use monetary policy to get the economy out of recession in that case. So the target is typically around 2%. It gives them a little bit, 2% inflation, gives them some ability to change the nominal interest rate. Even if they bring it down to zero, there'd be a -2 real interest rate. Right, the real interest rate is the inflation rate. The nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. And so they would have some ability to move interest rates to bring the economy back to full employment in a recession situation in that case. So that's part of the reason that they look at roughly a 2% inflation rate as one of their targets. Finally, in the last section of this chapter, talks about the challenges of reducing inflation. So if there's already inflation happening in the economy, how do you bring that down? And that is a matter of changing inflationary expectations. And that can be costly, as this section points out. What you've got to do is you've got to raise interest rates if you're the Federal Reserve to try and slow down the economy. But if you do that too much and too fast, that can lead to a severe recession. That will help bring down inflationary expectations, but it will reduce increase the unemployment rate, reduce real GDP, and you can have a severe recession. So that's a challenge for the Federal Reserve to try and bring inflation down without causing a recession. But it's also a challenge not to have inflationary expectations set in once the actual inflation is being experienced by people. They adjust their inflationary expectations up. In the first section of this chapter, we see that the Phillips curve increases then for a given level of unemployment. You have a higher level of actual inflation in the economy then. So to do that, you've got to really reduce those inflationary expectations, and you can either do it gradually or you can do it rapidly. So the rapid cold turkey approach can lead to a severe recession. We actually saw that happening earlier in the U.S. after a high inflationary period in the 1970s. What followed was the Federal Reserve really taking a strong approach to try and get those expectations out of the economy. If the inflation rate isn't as high, then you can maybe use a more gradual approach. We haven't seen a lot of high inflation until the early part of 2022. And so it hasn't really been a big issue. The question in 2022 is whether the higher inflation that people in the U.S. are experiencing will lead to higher inflationary expectations, which then will make it more difficult for the Federal Reserve to bring those inflationary expectations down. So that's really, we could talk, there are other ways that you could think about controlling inflation that are talked about in this section. Wage and price controls, generally that doesn't work very well. Credibility, reputation of the Federal Reserve, that's really what matters. And the last part of this section talks about how the Federal Reserve in particular worked to reduce inflationary expectations in the 1980s. You can see this period of the 1980 to 86 or so. That was following a run-up in inflation during the 1960s and into the early 1970s, mid-1970s. And the Federal Reserve really needed to pursue contractionary policy to bring that expected inflation down. But if we had real GDP or the unemployment rate here, you'd see that that caused a significant decrease in real GDP, increase in the unemployment rate. So we had to weather a significant recession in order to get those inflation rates out. And so the Federal Reserve has worked very hard to bring those down gradually over time, right? Since then, because it didn't want to have to experience the kind of situation we had in the 1970s and then the follow-up in the 1980s, early 1980s. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the U.S. economy following the inflation that has occurred since the beginning of 2022. So this is a good test case for that. So that is chapter 12, really talking about the relationship between unemployment and inflation, whether that original Phillips curve, which showed that there is an inverse relationship between the two, can be used by policymakers to essentially say, okay, you want to have lower inflation, then we might have to put up with some higher unemployment. Or if you want lower unemployment, you might have to put up with higher inflation. We haven't seen that in the 2000s particularly. We've been able to have low inflation and low unemployment rates. And again, we need to go back to our original model, our aggregate demand, aggregate supply, ISLM model, and we can explain part of the reasons for that. The question is what causes shocks in the economy and how do policymakers respond to those shocks.